It started like any other flight, a routine takeoff, passengers settling into their seats, and the usual hum of the plane as it climbed into the sky. But what happened next would change everything for one young man, and not in a way anyone could have predicted. He was just a teenager, barely 17, traveling alone for the first time. It was his dream to be in first class, and after weeks of saving every penny, he had finally managed to get the upgrade. His heart raced as he settled into the plush seat, feeling like he was on top of the world. For the first time, he didn't feel like just another passenger. He felt special. But his sense of pride would be short-lived. A flight attendant approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She glanced at the teen's boarding pass, then looked up at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice polite but with an edge. "You're not supposed to be sitting here." Confused, he looked around the cabin, the other first-class passengers staring blankly ahead, ignoring the interaction. "I've got the upgrade," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I paid for this seat." Her smile vanished as she raised her eyebrows. "That seat is for paying customers only, and you don't belong here." He froze. Was she serious? This couldn't be happening. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little firmer now. "I've got the upgrade. I've got a ticket just like everyone else." The flight attendant didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to the other flight attendants, exchanging a glance. After a moment, she returned her gaze to him. "I'm going to have to ask you to move, sir. There are plenty of empty seats in the economy class." His heart began to pound in his chest. He felt like everyone was watching, but no one said a word. He glanced around, feeling the weight of the moment. His hands clenched into fists. He wasn't sure what to do. This was a nightmare. But what happened next would show him exactly how far he was willing to go to stand up for what was right. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. "Why am I being asked to leave when I've got a valid ticket for this seat?" The flight attendant took a deep breath. "I don't have time to explain," she said curtly. "I'm just doing my job." In that moment, the teen's frustration reached a boiling point. But as he started to argue, something inside him clicked. He wasn't just going to let this go. He knew someone who could fix this, someone who could make the airline listen, someone who wasn't going to back down. With one swift motion, he pulled out his phone, dialed the number he knew by heart, and waited for the call to connect. The flight attendant didn't notice at first, but as the teen began speaking into the phone, her demeanor shifted. She glanced over at him, a subtle tension rising in her expression, but he didn't care. Not anymore. He had made the call. The wheels were in motion. This was only the beginning. And soon, everyone would know what happened when you underestimated the power of one phone call. The teen's fingers gripped the phone tighter as it rang, his heart racing with anticipation. He could feel the flight attendant's eyes on him now, her stance becoming more rigid. But there was no turning back. He'd made the call, and now he had to trust that the person on the other end of the line would come through. As the phone rang, he couldn't help but think about everything that had led him to this point. The countless hours of work, the sacrifices, the dreams of flying in first class. All of that had been reduced to this humiliating moment. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about respect, about fairness. The phone clicked, and a deep voice answered. "Yeah." It was sharp, direct, the voice of someone who didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Blake," the teen said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's me. I'm on a flight, and I need your help." There was a brief pause before the voice on the other end responded. "What's going on?" "I'm being kicked out of first class," the teen said, keeping his words clear and concise. "I paid for this seat. But the flight attendant, she's saying I don't belong here. I need you to fix this." On the other end, Mr. Blake was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his tone unwavering. "Where are you flying? And who's the airline?" The teen quickly gave the details, his anxiety rising with every second. He couldn't believe it was happening. His worst nightmare unfolding in real time. He had called someone he trusted, but would they be able to help in time? Would they even be able to make a difference? Mr. Blake's voice broke through the tension. "You did the right thing by calling me. Stay calm. I'll take care of this. Just keep your phone on you, and don't let them push you around. I'll get them to listen." Before the teen could respond, the line went dead. The call had ended. The teen looked at his phone, unsure whether to feel relieved or even more worried. The weight of the situation hit him harder now. He was relying on someone who had connections, someone who could get things done. But would it work? Could he really make the airline listen? As the flight attendant returned to his row, her gaze even colder than before, he stood up, ready to defend himself. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. But just as he was about to say something, his phone buzzed again. He quickly checked the screen. A new message. It was from Mr. Blake. "I've already made some calls. Just hold tight." That was all it took. The teen felt a surge of confidence wash over him. Mr. Blake had the power to make things happen. It wasn't over yet. The flight attendant stood there, waiting, clearly frustrated. "Well?" she asked, her tone impatient. "Are you going to move, or do I need to get security involved?" He looked up at her, his expression calm now. "No, I'm not moving," he said firmly. "I've done nothing wrong, and I've got someone who'll be speaking to your management about this. So, if you want to continue this, feel free to call them. But I'm staying right here." The flight attendant's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She was used to passengers folding under pressure, not standing up to her. But this time was different. She glanced around the cabin again, likely considering whether it was worth escalating things further. The teen held his ground. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen. Another message from Mr. Blake. "Done. They're pulling you from the plane." The teen's pulse quickened. He couldn't believe it. Before he could process what was happening, the flight attendant suddenly turned on her heel, marching down the aisle. Moments later, another staff member appeared, speaking urgently to her. It was clear they were preparing to take action, but he had no idea how far this was going to go. Then, in a sudden, almost surreal moment, the plane jolted slightly. The seatbelt sign flashed on, and an announcement came over the speaker. "We've experienced a minor technical issue and will be returning to the gate." The teen's heart sank. What had just happened? The flight attendants were now moving swiftly down the aisles, making sure everyone was seated, their faces tight with concern. The teen remained in his seat, still unsure of what was unfolding. But he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just about getting kicked out of first class anymore. This was bigger than that. And as the plane began to make its way back to the gate, the teen felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He had made the call. He had stood his ground. And whatever came next, he knew he wasn't the one who was going to be backing down. The wheels touched the tarmac with a dull thud as the plane returned to the gate. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, trying to piece together why the flight that had just taken off was now back where it started. No one had answers, and that uncertainty created a ripple of tension throughout the cabin. The teen sat still, phone in his hand, eyes forward. He could feel the weight of stares, silent questions that filled the space around him, but he didn't look back. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone. Not yet. He read the message again. Done. They're pulling you from the plane. It didn't feel real, but as the front cabin door opened and the sound of footsteps approached, reality settled in fast. Two men in suits stepped into the aircraft. They didn't wear airline uniforms. These weren't flight attendants. These were corporate. The kind of people that never show up on a plane unless something serious was happening. The lead man whispered something to the cabin crew. Heads turned, expressions shifted. One of the attendants, who had kept her distance during the earlier confrontation, now walked briskly toward the teen's row. She didn't say anything this time, just stopped beside him, clearly unsure of how to handle what was about to go down. Then came the voice. Calm, firm, and direct. "Sir," the man in the suit said, addressing the teen. "Can you please come with us?" The teen glanced up, unsure. "Am I in trouble?" The man shook his head. "No, sir. You're not in any trouble. But we need to speak with you. Off the plane." He stood slowly, unsure of what he'd find outside the cabin doors. But as he stepped into the jet bridge, the reality became clearer. Two more suited individuals stood waiting, along with a woman holding a tablet. She looked official. Airline staff, maybe a supervisor or manager. Her expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. She looked like someone caught in the middle of something much bigger than she was prepared for. The woman stepped forward. "I'm Dana Walters, Senior Flight Operations Manager for the airline. Can I speak with you for a moment?" He nodded. "We've been informed of an incident involving one of our crew members and your assigned seat. Is that correct?" "Yes," he answered. "I was sitting in first class. I had a confirmed ticket, but I was told I didn't belong there." Her eyes didn't leave his. "And you contacted someone outside the airline?" "I did." She tapped on the tablet and took a breath. "The person you contacted has reached out to our executive team. That call came directly to our CEO's office." The teen blinked. He had known Mr. Blake had pull, but this level of escalation, it was bigger than he thought. Dana continued. "I want to be very clear with you. We take these matters seriously. If you were mistreated or discriminated against, we will conduct a full investigation. But for now, we need to make a decision about whether this flight continues as planned." He frowned. "Because of me?" "No," she said. "Because of us. You're not in the wrong here. But when something like this happens, and corporate gets involved mid-flight, we have a protocol. That means pausing everything until the situation is understood." He looked back toward the cabin. The plane still hadn't moved. Passengers were seated, probably wondering what the holdup was. He couldn't hear anything from inside, but the silence outside spoke volumes. Dana checked something on her tablet again. "The flight's on hold until further notice. We've grounded it for now." That word, grounded, hit like a hammer. He hadn't expected this. Sure, he'd wanted accountability, but bringing an entire flight to a standstill? This was something else. "I didn't want this to happen," he said. "I just wanted to keep the seat I paid for." She nodded slowly. "And that's exactly the point. You shouldn't have had to fight for it. We're going to figure out why this happened, and the right people are going to hear about it." There was a moment of silence as everyone took in the weight of what was happening. Then one of the men in suits stepped closer. "Do you have a few minutes? There's someone who wants to speak with you. In private." The teen nodded, still stunned, and followed them down the terminal. The farther they walked, the more surreal it all felt. Just an hour ago, he had been a regular passenger. Now he was at the center of a corporate meltdown. They reached a lounge, a quiet area behind frosted glass doors. One of the men opened the door and gestured for him to step inside. There, sitting at a small table, was a man in a dark blazer, speaking quietly into a phone. He looked up as the teen entered, gave a small nod, then ended the call. "I'm James Clay," the man said. "I work directly with the airline's Executive Affairs Division." The teen took a seat. "Am I in trouble?" Clay shook his head. "Number, but the airline is." He paused, then continued. "Mr. Blake contacted our CEO, not through customer service, not through press. He called the personal line." The teen raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't happen often," Clay added. "And when it does, it means someone dropped the ball in a big way." He reached into a folder and slid over a printed document. "Here's a copy of your seat confirmation. You were absolutely assigned to 3A. No mistake, paid, verified, logged." The teen nodded. "I knew it. I showed the flight attendant my ticket, but she didn't want to look at it." Clay leaned back. "That's where this becomes a problem. We're not just dealing with a seat mix-up. We're dealing with judgment, assumption, and whether or not that assumption was based on something more personal." The air hung heavy in the room. "I'm not saying anything publicly right now," Clay said carefully, "but I will say this. You're not the first complaint involving that particular crew member. There's a pattern." The teen's pulse picked up, so it wasn't just about him. Clay stood. "We're going to make this right. You're going to be rebooked, upgraded again on a different flight. We'll handle everything. But I also need you to know, you've just changed things. People are watching this case closely now." The teen rose slowly, still processing everything. "What about the flight I was on? Are they still grounded?" Clay nodded. "Until further notice, the crew is being replaced, and a formal inquiry starts today." The teen didn't smile. Not yet. But for the first time since that moment in the sky, he didn't feel powerless anymore. This wasn't over, not even close. As the teen stepped out of the executive lounge, a quiet buzz followed him. Airport staff with earpieces whispering updates, a supervisor walking briskly down the terminal, a pair of security personnel redirecting confused passengers who had been scheduled for the now grounded flight. He wasn't trying to be a spectacle, but that's exactly what he had become. Without speaking a word, he had managed to turn a moment of dismissal into a wave of disruption that was now climbing through the ranks of a multi-billion-dollar airline. His phone vibrated again. Handled. "We'll talk more when you land. Proud of you." That message meant more than he could say, and it gave him just enough strength to keep walking without second-guessing himself. Back near the check-in counters, an agent with a calm, neutral face greeted him. "Sir, we've rebooked you on a direct flight out in 2 hours. First class, seat 1A. You'll have a pre-boarding escort. Please follow me to the private lounge in the meantime." No chaos, no resistance, just accommodation, professional, polite, almost too smooth, like they were hoping he'd just disappear from the public eye without stirring the pot any further. But he wasn't going to disappear. Not anymore. As he settled into the quiet lounge, watching planes taxi along the runway through tall glass windows, something shifted inside him. He hadn't asked to be part of anything, but now he was, whether he wanted it or not. A few minutes later, the door cracked open. A woman in a black blazer stepped in, carrying a tablet and an envelope. She sat across from him and didn't waste time with small talk. "My name is Lauren Tate. I work with the Legal and Compliance Division of the airline. You're under no obligation to speak with me, but I'd like to ask if you're comfortable giving a statement now, on the record." He raised an eyebrow. "A statement?" "Yes," she replied. "We're beginning a formal review of the incident. Your statement could help confirm internal records and crew behavior. You don't have to answer any questions you're not comfortable with." He nodded slowly. "All right." She hit record and placed the tablet on the table between them. "Please state your name for the record." He gave it. "Can you describe what happened, starting from the moment you boarded the plane?" And so, for the first time, he told the full story. How he had shown his boarding pass, how the flight attendant had barely glanced at it, how she'd told him the seat was unavailable, and how her tone shifted when he stood his ground. How she seemed to doubt him simply because he didn't look like the kind of passenger she was used to seeing in first class. Lauren didn't interrupt. She only asked questions for clarity. When he finished, she reached for the envelope. "We're reviewing in-flight recordings as part of our investigation," she said. "We're also gathering witness statements from passengers who may have overheard the interaction." He looked at the envelope. "What's that?" "This is a formal apology from the airline, signed by the Vice President of Customer Relations. It includes a voucher and a letter stating that we're investigating the issue. You're free to read it now or later. Up to you." He took the envelope but didn't open it. Lauren stood. "Someone will be in touch in the coming days. I know this wasn't what you expected from a simple flight." "No," he said. "It wasn't." She paused before she left. "Just know, this matters. The way you stood up for yourself, it's already being talked about. Not just inside the company. Word's spreading." He sat back in his seat after she left, hands resting on the envelope. He hadn't opened it yet, and honestly, the letter wasn't the point. A seat, an upgrade, an apology. None of those were why he was still sitting here. Because behind every apology was a system, and when the system assumed something about you before you even said a word, the apology always came after the damage was done. His phone buzzed again. "The story's getting out. Check the link I sent." He clicked the link. It led to a trending post from a well-known travel influencer, sharing a short video that someone had captured inside the plane. You couldn't hear every word, but it clearly showed the flight attendant standing over his seat, arms crossed, looking down at him. The body language said enough. The comments were already filling up. "Unbelievable. This still happens? Good for him for not moving. Airlines need to do better." A few scrolls later, a news outlet had picked it up too, and just like that, it wasn't just his flight anymore. It was everyone's. Another message came through. "Heads up. She's been removed from active duty. Temporary suspension. Internal review underway." His fingers hovered over the screen. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was accountability. The difference between the two meant everything, especially now. Across the terminal, boarding was being announced for a new flight. This time, there would be no questioning, no extra checks, no challenge to his presence in the seat he had rightfully earned. But even as he walked through the priority lane toward the gate, one thought echoed loudest in his mind. How many others had stayed silent? How many people had moved to the back of the plane, or even off it, just to avoid conflict. And how many times had no one noticed at all? This time was different. This time, people were watching. And he wasn't done yet. By the time the wheels lifted off the runway, the story had left the terminal far behind. His phone stayed on airplane mode, but even then, the weight of what was unfolding outside that cabin followed him. He wasn't seated next to anyone. Seat 1A came with a kind of invisible perimeter. But even in silence, he could feel the occasional glance from other passengers. Not intrusive, not mocking. Just aware. The captain hadn't said anything out of the ordinary during the welcome announcement. No references to previous delays. No hint that just hours ago, this same airline had been forced to ground an entire flight because of one uncomfortable truth. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the jet. The quiet hum of the engines masked the tension behind his eyes. Because this wasn't just over an upgrade or a seat. It was about a moment where someone looked at him, not at his ticket, not at his status, not even at his behavior, but at him, and decided, with no words needed, that he didn't belong. When the plane landed, he switched his phone back on. The notifications were instant and overwhelming. A group chat with his friends was blowing up. "Bro, you're literally on the news. Check CNN's feed. You're on it. The internet's losing it, and you're the center of it." He clicked into the news article. It was official now. The headline read, "Teen claims he was removed from first-class seat based on appearance. Airline grounds flight for investigation." Below that, a subheading detailed the video footage circulating online, the delay, the apology issued mid-airport, and the fact that legal representatives from the airline had already acknowledged that an internal review had begun. It had only been hours, but already the pieces were in motion. Then came the texts from unknown numbers. "This is Diana from Morning Wave. Would love to get your voice on the record. National talk shows are asking for interviews. We'd like to offer a platform to tell your side. No editing, no spin." He put the phone down. A day ago, he was just another teen traveling alone. Now suddenly everyone wanted his side of the story. But that phrase stuck with him. His side? There was no side. There was what happened. And what people didn't want to admit still happened all the time. After getting his bag, he was met by a man in a sharp gray suit near the exit. No greeting, no smile, just a clipboard and a name badge that gave him away as a senior rep for the airline, the same company that had tried to brush him off just that morning. "We've arranged private transportation for you," the man said, "and a formal letter will be delivered to your address. Again, on behalf of the company, we apologize." He accepted the ride, but not the silence. Inside the car, he finally opened the envelope from earlier. The letter was written in clean corporate language. It expressed regret. It acknowledged a breakdown in service protocol and referenced a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It mentioned nothing about bias, nothing about judgment. It danced around the issue like it was afraid of it. At the bottom, a line caught his eye. "We will use this moment as an opportunity to retrain and educate our crew on the values we stand for." He folded the letter. This wasn't about values on paper. It was about the moment when someone had the chance to do the right thing and didn't. 2 days later, he agreed to one interview. Not for fame, not for clout, but because if his name was going to be attached to this moment, it was going to be on his terms. The interviewer sat across from him in a small, clean studio. She was soft-spoken, respectful, and she asked questions that mattered. What made you stay seated when she asked you to move? He didn't hesitate. Because I paid for that seat. Because I had every right to be there. Because if I gave it up, I'd be telling myself that her assumption was true, that I didn't belong. She nodded. Did you ever think it would get this far? I wasn't trying to go viral, he said. I just didn't move. She paused, looking down at her notes. There are a lot of teens who've been through moments like this, quiet ones that no one ever talks about. What do you want them to take from this? He looked directly at the camera for the first time during the entire interview. You don't have to yell to be heard. You don't have to get angry to be right. You just have to know who you are, and not let someone else's discomfort make you question it. The interview went live that evening. Within hours, it had millions of views. The comments rolled in fast. This kid is solid. Handled it with more grace than most adults. That last line hit hard. And while the video trended, something else happened. Quietly. Other people started sharing their stories, videos, tweets, photos, not just with this airline, but across industries, moments when they were spoken to differently, treated differently, moved, ignored, doubted. A wave had started, and it wasn't slowing down. Later that night, another message came through. Internal memo just leaked. The flight attendant's employment is under final review. Policy changes are already in draft. But the teen didn't post about it. He didn't go on another show. He didn't need to, because the story was no longer about just him. It had become a mirror, one that a whole lot of people were finally being forced to look into. And this time, no one could look away. The storm didn't die down. If anything, the pressure only intensified as more people stepped forward with their own stories. And while the teen hadn't sought attention, his quiet defiance had made room for a louder conversation. One that couldn't be pushed aside with a pre-written apology or a corporate press release. His name was everywhere now. Across social media, podcasts, news panels, even people who didn't know the full story were using his name as a symbol of resilience, of calm resistance, of what it meant to challenge a system without shouting. But while the world focused on the headlines, he was still trying to process everything in real time. He was still in school, still dealing with homework, friends, and the weird shift in how people looked at him now. Some treated him like a celebrity, others tiptoed around him, unsure of what to say. One afternoon, a teacher pulled him aside after class. I just wanted to say I saw your interview, the way you handled yourself. That took real strength. He nodded. Thanks. You ever think about what you want to do with all this? He shrugged. I didn't plan any of it. The teacher smiled. Sometimes the best moments aren't planned. They just find you. That night, he opened a message that had been sitting unread for hours. It was from the airline's new PR director. Different tone, different energy. We understand that past communication may have missed the mark. We'd like to invite you to be part of a roundtable discussion with airline leadership. No cameras, just a conversation. Your experience can help shape the future of our passenger policies. He read it twice. He wasn't naive. He knew what it meant to be invited into a room like that. Some would call it a publicity move, a way to contain the fallout. But what if it was something else, too? A real chance to make sure no one else went through what he did. The meeting happened the following week. It wasn't held in some grand boardroom or dressed up with press photographers. Just a modest conference room with a long table, a few executives, and a quiet tension in the air. He spoke clearly, not angrily, just truthfully. I didn't make a scene. I didn't throw a fit. I sat in a seat I paid for, and that was enough to be questioned. One of the executives nodded slowly. We've reviewed the footage. We've spoken with the crew. What happened doesn't align with our values. Then your values need to be clearer, he said. Because your crew didn't just act on instinct. They acted on what they thought was normal. That's the real problem. There was a pause. Then another voice across the table spoke up. What would you change if you were in our position? He thought about it. Not just for a second, but deeply. Because if this wasn't just a one-time apology, then it had to be followed by real, meaningful steps. Start with training, he said. Not the surface-level stuff. Real education. Bring people in who understand what bias looks like when it's quiet, when it hides under protocol and policy. They took notes. Create a real accountability process, he continued. If someone crosses a line, don't wait until a video goes viral to take it seriously. He leaned forward. And don't make passengers prove they belong. That's not their job. It's yours to treat them like they do. The room was silent. But not in the way silence feels when nothing is being said. This was a silence that listened. That considered. After the meeting, he was offered a consulting position. Not a token title, but a chance to sit on a youth advisory panel being formed by the airline's diversity division. He said he'd think about it. Not because he wasn't interested, but because he wanted to make sure it wasn't just a checkbox on someone's PR checklist. If he was going to be part of change, it had to be real. Back at school, things had shifted again. A group of students had started a new initiative, focused on bias in public spaces, on being heard without having to raise your voice. They invited him to speak at their next assembly. I'm not really a speaker, he said, but they told him, you don't have to be. Just be honest. So he stood in front of a packed auditorium, his voice steady, his message simple. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't look loud. It doesn't have hashtags. It's just sitting still when someone tells you to stand up. Applause didn't follow right away. But the silence after he spoke said more than clapping ever could. And just like that, what began as one moment on one plane turned into something far bigger. He wasn't just the kid who didn't move. He was the kid who made others start thinking about why that moment had to happen in the first place. The airline issued a new policy update 2 weeks later. Mandatory training, bias response teams, a new first-class protocol that removed subjectivity from the boarding process. None of it happened because he yelled. It all happened because he stayed in his seat and stood his ground without ever leaving it. But there was still one more call he hadn't made. One conversation that was waiting, not with the media, not with a boardroom, but with someone who'd watched everything from afar. His father. The man who, with just one phone call, had grounded a plane. Not through rage, but through reach, influence, and the quiet power of knowing when to step in. And now, it was time to finally talk about that call. He wasn't avoiding the call. Not really. It just felt loaded. Because no matter how much attention the story got, no matter how many articles were written or interviews requested, there was still one person whose reaction mattered more than any headline. His dad had been quiet since it all went down. Not silent, just deliberate. The kind of quiet that says, I'm watching. I'm giving you space, but I'm still here. That call had grounded the plane. Shut everything down in a matter of minutes. But no one really knew what had been said. Not the passengers, not the crew, not even the airline itself. It wasn't public. It wasn't performative. It was power. used in the most controlled way possible. And that power came with weight. So when the teen finally called, it wasn't to thank him for stepping in. It was to talk. To really talk. His dad answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call." "I've been thinking," he said. "Yeah, me too." There was a pause, but it wasn't awkward. He continued, "I know you handled it. I just want to know, why did you do it that way?" His dad didn't rush his answer. "Because there's a difference between making noise and making impact. You were already doing the first part. I just made sure the second part happened too. I didn't even know you were watching. I'm always watching. I don't jump in unless I have to. But when that flight attendant put her hands on you, told you to get up like you didn't belong, that wasn't just about you. That was about how people see kids like you, especially when they're calm, when they're right, and still treated like they're wrong." He let that sink in. "You weren't wrong to sit there. And I wasn't wrong to make one call and make sure they understood who they were dealing with." "But who were they dealing with?" the teen asked. His dad chuckled lightly. "Someone they'd rather not piss off." It wasn't arrogance. It was history. His father had built a career around influence, not the kind you see flaunted on screens, but the type that sits in advisory roles, helps craft laws, moves conversations in closed-door rooms. And when he called that airline, he didn't threaten lawsuits. He didn't name-drop. He simply laid out facts, calmly, firmly, without room for debate. "My son paid for that seat. You removed him because your staff acted on bias, not policy. You've grounded the wrong plane, and unless you want this story told by someone with a much bigger microphone, you'll start by admitting that out loud." The airline had responded quickly, grounded the flight, pulled the crew, started an internal review before the teen even made it back to the terminal. But the teen wasn't just grateful. He was curious. "Did you know it would go this far?" His dad sighed. "I knew it could. But I also knew this wasn't about me. That's why I stepped back. You didn't need me to speak for you. You just needed room to be heard." And then more quietly, "You did that better than I ever could." That moment landed harder than expected. His dad, stoic, strong, unshakable, was looking at him not like a child who needed protection, but as a young man who had just shifted an entire conversation through patience, poise, and presence. "You didn't yell. You didn't lash out. You just stood in your truth," his dad said. And sometimes, that's what breaks the system the most. They talked for a while after that, about everything, about what came next. Not just for the airline or the policy changes, but for him, his path, his choices, how he wanted to use this moment without becoming consumed by it. Because now, people were asking him to speak on panels. Schools were inviting him to mentor younger students. Journalists wanted exclusive follow-ups. Some companies even offered sponsorships or internships. But he wasn't sure what was genuine and what was just the aftermath of viral attention. "I don't want to be a brand," he told his dad. "Then don't," he said simply. "Be a voice. Speak when you have something to say, not when they expect you to." That stuck with him. In the days that followed, the airline launched a new campaign. Not flashy or self-congratulatory, but focused on accountability. They started publishing their internal reports, listed the number of passenger complaints by category, even opened a submission portal for anonymous feedback. And while it was clearly a response to what had happened, they didn't center him in it. No photo ops, no PR stunt, just policy, visible and traceable. Meanwhile, he went back to class. back to homework, back to regular life that now carried a subtle echo of everything he'd gone through. Some days it felt surreal. Other days it felt heavier. Because being seen as a symbol is strange when you never asked to be one. One evening, while sitting in his room scrolling through news articles, he saw a headline from a small local paper in another state. Teen wrongfully removed from first class inspires policy shift in local airline. It was a minor story, no viral traction, but the airline cited his case as the catalyst for reviewing their own training procedures. And that's when he realized something. This wasn't about the one airline, or even the one flight. This was about the ripple. Because one act of dignity, just sitting still, refusing to budge, had moved farther than he could have imagined. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. There was still one more person he hadn't heard from. The flight attendant. The woman who started it all with one assumption, one order, and a single, irreversible decision. And this time, she was the one reaching out. The message came in quietly. Not through social media, not through public channels. It was an email sent to his school account, forwarded by an administrator who wasn't sure what to do with it. Subject line: I need to say something. He knew who it was before he even opened it. Her name was there. No hiding behind legal teams, no aliases, just her words, unfiltered and direct. He hesitated before reading it, not out of fear, but because of everything that moment had carried. The sting of being humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers, the echo of whispers, the silence after being told he didn't belong. Still, he clicked. I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if I even deserve for it to. But I'm writing because I owe you something I didn't give you on that flight. The truth. The words were carefully chosen. She hadn't written them in a rush. She admitted to her mistake. Not with legal-safe language, but with the kind of honesty that doesn't come easy for someone who's been protected by structure and seniority for years. I saw you sitting there and assumed you weren't supposed to be. It wasn't about your clothes, your seat number, or even the tone of your voice. It was me, my own bias, my own failure. He read the sentence 3 times. There was no excuse attached, no justification masked as apology. I've been in this job for over 16 years. I've flown every route, dealt with every kind of situation. I thought I was fair. I thought I was trained enough to see people clearly. But I wasn't. And you showed me that. Without raising your voice, without pushing back the way I probably would have if our roles were reversed. She went on to explain how the aftermath had affected her, how the airline had removed her from active duty during the investigation, how she'd started therapy, how she'd enrolled in courses, ones she should have taken long ago. Not because the airline told her to, but because, in her own words, what I did wasn't just wrong. It was lazy, and lazy thinking leads to harm. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for a response. She only asked for one thing. Please don't let my failure define you, and please keep showing people what it looks like to stand still and still stand tall. He didn't know how to feel after reading that. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was human. She had broken something, and now she was trying quietly to take responsibility for it. He thought about responding for hours, typed and deleted 6 drafts. But when he finally did reply, he kept it short. I heard you, and I hope others do too. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't soften the impact, but he gave space for her words to land, because that's what he'd wanted in the beginning. Not punishment, not spectacle, just the space to be seen as a full person. That single exchange didn't erase what happened, but it shifted the air around it. Because accountability, when it comes unforced, carries weight that statements and press releases never can. In the weeks after, something changed. Not just in how the airline handled things, but in how schools, news outlets, and even strangers talked to him. The narrative wasn't just about the injustice anymore. It was about how calm can be powerful, how control can be louder than outrage, and how dignity, when held firm, can move systems without tearing them down. One morning, he was asked to speak at a student leadership forum. He almost said no, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't want to become that kid from the plane. But something inside him had shifted, not toward fame, not toward attention, just clarity. When he stood at the podium, he didn't talk about the flight, not directly. He started with a different kind of story. A lot of people think power is about what you say. I've learned it's also about what you don't say. The moment you decide not to yell, not to crumble, not to fit the box they try to put you in, that's when you're hardest to ignore. The room went still, because they all knew. Without saying it, they knew. He wasn't just sharing a story. He was showing them how to write their own. Later, as he stepped off the stage, a teacher approached him. Older man, silver hair, soft voice. "I was on that flight," he said. The teen blinked. "You were?" "I watched it all. Wanted to speak up, but I froze. I've thought about it every day since, and I want you to know what you did. It mattered." It hit harder than he expected, not because it was praise, but because it was proof. Proof that silence is a ripple too, but not always the kind that drowns. Sometimes it just waits, listens, and learns. And when it finally finds the courage to speak, it does so with clarity that echoes far beyond the first drop. And that echo was still traveling. Because soon, an unexpected call came. Not from a reporter, not from the airline, but from the Department of Transportation. They wanted to meet. The phone call wasn't long. No fanfare, no media buildup. Just a calm, professional voice asking if he would be open to a conversation with representatives from the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division. It didn't even hit him at first how big that was. Until his mom leaned over the counter, phone still in her hand, and said, "They don't reach out unless they're paying attention." And they were. When he arrived at the federal building, he didn't walk in like someone demanding attention. He walked in like someone who knew exactly why he was there. Not for a spotlight, not for revenge. Just a simple question. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? They listened. Every word. No one interrupted when he explained the timeline of that day. The way his boarding pass had been questioned. How the flight attendant hadn't just asked him to move, but assumed he'd done something wrong. The way his calm response had been twisted into suspicious behavior. The way the entire plane had paused, watching him as if he were the disruption instead of the one being disrupted. But it wasn't just about that one flight anymore. He talked about what it meant to walk into certain spaces and be treated like an intruder. The weight of always having to prove that you belong. The way young people like him were trained, subtly over years, to speak a little softer, move a little slower, just so they wouldn't be perceived as a threat. When he finished, one of the representatives spoke up. "We've seen cases like yours before, but rarely with the clarity and restraint you've shown. Most end in chaos. You've turned this into something else entirely." They asked him if he would help them, not with a campaign, not with a public apology from the airline, but with designing a protocol. A real, tangible set of training tools for staff. One that went beyond sensitivity and focused on actual accountability. One that didn't just teach flight attendants and crew members to recognize bias, but forced them to examine the systems that reward it. He agreed. Not immediately, but after thinking it through. Because if his story was going to be used, he was going to be the one to tell it. On his terms, with his voice, he worked with a small task force over the next several weeks. Real experts, civil rights advocates, airline reps, transportation officials, even a few retired flight attendants who dealt with discrimination of their own over the years. Together they built something different, a training module that started with his story, but not to inspire guilt. It started with facts, footage, testimonies, a breakdown of how bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks in wearing a uniform and a polite smile, and then it showed what happens when someone refuses to shrink in the face of that. That training was approved for testing in 5 major U.S. airlines. The airline from his incident? They adopted it voluntarily, not under legal threat. But because the storm they'd faced wasn't just about damage control. It had shown them their blind spots, and they'd finally stopped pretending they didn't exist. Back home, things moved forward. School, friendships, applications for programs he once thought were out of reach. But something shifted in how people talked to him. He wasn't just the kid from the plane anymore. He was the one who'd grounded the flight, and then helped build the runway afterward. There were critics, of course. People online who said he should have let it go. Said he was lucky to even be in first class to begin with. He didn't answer them. Didn't need to. Because every time he stepped onto a plane now, any airline, any route, he knew something had changed. Not because the world had magically healed, but because the next kid who boarded first class wouldn't be questioned before even taking his seat. And if they were, there'd be a process, a protocol, a system. Because one quiet teenager had the courage to stay seated in the right place, long enough for the whole country to stand up and listen. It all came to a head one day at a panel he'd been invited to. Civil rights leaders, transportation heads, airline executives, even the Secretary of Transportation himself. During the closing remarks, they asked if he had anything to add. He looked out at the room, lights low, eyes forward, everyone waiting. And then he said, "The goal was never to be a symbol. It was just to be treated like everyone else. So if your system only works for the loudest, or the wealthiest, or the ones who already look like they belong, you don't have a system. You have a mirror. And it's time to change the reflection." Applause came slowly, then louder, then standing, not for drama, but for truth, the kind of truth that doesn't need shouting to be heard. And somewhere in the back row, a familiar face stood, quietly watching. It was her, not in uniform, not behind a badge of authority, just a person, still learning. And that, more than anything, proved the journey was working. Because change doesn't start with rules. It starts when people stop denying what's been broken. The months that followed weren't filled with headlines, no breaking news segments, no viral clips bouncing across social media. But they were filled with change. Real, slow, steady change. Across airports in the country, conversations started happening in places where silence used to sit. Gate agents began pausing before challenging a seat assignment. Flight crews started to notice the assumptions they'd been making on autopilot. And travelers, especially those who'd never been questioned about belonging, were finally starting to see how invisible lines had been drawn. He didn't chase the spotlight, even though it kept trying to follow him. Interviews, panels, college invitations, people calling him brave, brilliant, even heroic, but he kept it simple. "I just told the truth," he'd say, "and I didn't move." He finished high school quietly, on time, grades solid. A few teachers nodded with subtle pride when he walked the stage to get his diploma, knowing he had made more of an impact in that 1 year than some people did in decades. College came with a scholarship offer, not because of his story, but because of how he carried it. Like a weight he never used to crush anyone, only to lift what was broken. He chose a university that didn't ask him to retell the incident over and over, but instead asked how they could learn from it, how they could equip other young people to lead from a place of calm strength. But his work wasn't done. By the time he turned 20, he had helped draft a series of nationwide guidelines adopted by several airline associations. These weren't just rules for avoiding discrimination. They were policies that required airlines to track complaints by race, age, and status, and to investigate patterns that couldn't be ignored anymore. At the same time, he co-founded a mentorship program for teens of color who wanted to enter the aviation industry, not just as passengers, but as pilots, engineers, policy advisors, even flight attendants. "Don't just board the plane," he told them. "Be the one flying it. Be the one designing it. Be the one rewriting the manual." And they did. His story was no longer just a chapter in a controversy. It became a spark that lit up classrooms, boardrooms, flight decks. Years later, on a quiet afternoon, he received a letter. Not an email, not a DM, a handwritten letter. It was from a young boy who'd been watching his story unfold from afar. Someone who'd once been pulled aside in an airport, questioned for acting suspicious, just because he was playing music on his phone and laughing too loudly. He wrote, "I used to be scared of flying, not because of the plane, but because of what might happen to me on it. Then I read about you, and now I know if they ever try to move me out of my seat, I don't have to get loud. I just have to stay still. I just have to know I belong there." He folded the letter slowly and tucked it in the back of a journal he'd started keeping, not to document pain, but to track progress. And the journal was thick now, not with trauma, but with victories. Not all big. Some were as small as a flight attendant catching herself before making a snap judgment. Some were as meaningful as a family boarding first class without second glances. And some were as massive as airlines publicly reporting progress, year over year, not to impress the public, but to measure how far they still had to go. He had become part of something that couldn't be reversed. One action, staying in his seat, had grounded a plane. But more than that, it had grounded an industry that too often flew above accountability. By standing still, he had forced the system to move, not with anger, with truth. And as he sat in a quiet airport years later, headphones in, backpack at his feet, first-class ticket in hand, no one stared. No one whispered. No one checked his pass twice. When the gate opened, he walked in first, just like anyone else. Not because he was someone special, but because the seat had always been his. And now, finally, the world had caught up to that fact.